My friends, good evening. I don't know why the newspapers aren't covering what I'll share today. This is an extremely serious decision which will ruin Europe, which will continue the economic downward spiral of the countries in the European Union. You know me, I've been fighting against scamology and the ideological excesses behind it for years. Well, this week, Qatar announced that it will not supply oil to Europe next year. ExxonMobil followed suit and said, we probably won't supply oil to Europe next year. And probably in the days to come, watch the news if your favorite newspaper ever wants to tell you about it. You'll see that other countries will start to distance themselves from supplying energy to Europe. What is it about? You should know that Europe constantly creates regulations, laws, and standards and associates them with huge fines. If you remember, a few years ago, they introduced the General Data Protection Regulation, which was that data protection law, and they associated violations of this law. They associated it with penalties, with fines based on revenue. So a percentage? No, not profits. So it's not a fixed amount. It's not a percentage of profits, it's a percentage of revenue. So you can imagine the deterrent effect that has. Since then, Europe has enjoyed it. So regularly, they come out with new regulations, new standards, laws, stuff like that. So they spend their time coming up with stuff like that, and they pretty systematically associate them with fines based on revenue. Let me just remind you that a company can have huge revenue, but it can be hard to feel. Revenue is just the money that goes through its accounts. It's not necessarily profit. So you can imagine for companies, especially energy companies, that, for example, have a lot of money circulating, that means they have huge cash flows, but operate with rather low margins after taxes and everything. Look, for example, in the United Kingdom, we have offshore drilling companies that had to shut down because their tax rate went up to 110%. That's right, 110%. So it was a confiscatory, punitive, and discouraging levy meant to push them into bankruptcy and force them to leave. All right? Because there are the escrolots who are now pounding the ramp in its Achilles heel. And it's not just Europe's Achilles heel, it's the Achilles heel of any civilization that respects itself. It's energy. When you destroy energy, everything goes down the drain afterwards. Remember, back during the bombing of Iraq, when the international coalition bombed Iraq, what did they hit first? They hit the energy infrastructure. If you look at any war, it always starts with the energy infrastructure. Because once you break the energy, there's no more electricity, the machines stop, the trams stop, the lights go out. There's nothing left. No heat, air conditioning vehicles, trains or planes. At that moment, you'll see the country comes to a standstill. But that's what Europe is doing to itself without a single missile. So what's this about? Why does Qatar say they don't want to work with the Europeans? Why does Exxon say it? And others will probably say it in the coming days, right? It's that Europe next year will implement CSDDD. So you'll see CSDDD. I suggest you Google it. So CS3D is it's an ecological flight of fancy. It's an ideological flight of the European Union that says that, in fact, you've already heard about what we call the environmental, social, and governance score, the environmental score in my videos or elsewhere. Social governance, all that, have you heard about that? That there's a kind of ideological mess where they put carbon impact, impact on society, impact on the climate, gender equality, of air something or other, whatever ideologues want, they add. Well, what we're going to do is create a super European regulation that can be enforced against companies throughout their entire production chain. And we'll see if they comply, among other things, with the Paris climate agreements. That means that Europe, which is freezing right now, which is the coldest inhabited continent on Earth, is obsessed with global warming. And it tells Exxon, it tells Qatar, it tells others, you have to prove to us that you're doing enough for the climate. These people who are serious people who work, who have jobs, say, listen, we don't see how we can do anything for the global climate. We don't manage it or have the button in our office. So what the European Union wants is for these companies to demonstrate throughout their entire production chain. That means it's more than asking Exxon or Qatar to ensure they take climate action themselves, right? Across their entire production chain, including partners and suppliers. So tomorrow you might have Exxon, well, getting sued because a company on the other side of the world from whom Exxon bought pipes, pump valves, software, computers, whatever. Well, that company didn't comply with the Paris climate agreements. You see what's going to happen. Exxon will be fined, will be subjected to a fine by the European Union. The fine is 5% of their revenue. So if they have a revenue of 100 billion, the fine will be 5 billion. So what's extraordinary as well, you realize that it's the European bureaucracy that comes up with this regulation. It's this same bureaucracy that decides who has violated this regulation. In the end, it's the same bureaucracy that will take the money when it rules a party hasn't followed the regulation. You can see the conflict of interest and the Pandora's box it opens. So what happens? Today, these companies are starting to see Europe as a hostile territory. That means you can't work with Europeans, because if you provide them with a drop of oil, they can turn against you. They can take the oil for years and years. And then one day they give you a bill to settle all accounts, and you'll have to pay them back for all the oil you sold them, plus interest on top of that. You will have to. Not only will they get the oil for free, but on top of that, you'll have to pay them for it. Okay. That's at 5% of the turnover. There isn't a single chief executive officer, not a single serious chief financial officer who would say, yes, yeah, it's fine, I'll involve my company in that. Even professional insurance doesn't cover it. Even the insurance companies say, no, we can't cover that. Especially for companies that have supply chains, that have contractor chains that are absolutely endless, stretching all over the planet. You'll see an ecosystem around these companies with thousands of businesses, large and small, offering a variety of services. These companies can't reasonably pursue everything. Their supplier could go and see if they're doing something for the climate. It's just not possible. It won't work. So the European demand is an unrealistic demand. And if companies ignore this demand and keep selling in Europe, well, that's it. 18 months later, 2 years later, they could get caught and have to pay billions. That's why they say if that's how it is, we'd rather pull out. You can see that at a much lower rate. Remember when the General Data Protection Regulation came out, and it was a regulatory mess with fines that could go, I think, up to 7%. There are multiple levels, like 2 and 7% of the turnover. There were a lot of websites that became inaccessible in Europe. Many American websites display a message saying they're not accessible from Europe, so you need a VPN to access them. Well, that was just a few years ago, and those were sites that blocked access from Europe. Today, an iron wall is falling, leaving Europe behind an iron curtain and sidelining it among nations. So, in this same context where we have this regulation coming next year, which is going to drive away a lot of energy companies and others as well, because right now it's just energy companies, but there will be others affected because the regulation doesn't specifically target energy companies. It targets all companies that want to do business in Europe. You'll see many will withdraw or distance themselves. Some with employees might lay them off. All right, so it's going to become a territory governed by ideology and shielded by strict regulations. We're talking about a form of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics times 10. I'm not sure that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had as many laws, as many absurd regulations, right? I've read my classics, the Soviet authors, all that. But I think that Europe has still surpassed that horrible thing we used to call the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So in this context, note that Europe is increasingly closing its doors to energy coming from Russia. So no Russian energy, no energy from Qatar, no energy from anywhere. How are they actually going to manage? How are people going to heat their homes? How are people going to work? That's why we're seeing a gradual collapse of European businesses. Every few days we hear that a certain company has gone bankrupt. Companies that sometimes have existed for centuries are shutting down. Without energy, it's very simple, I'm telling you. Without energy, there is no economy. If there is no economy, it's widespread poverty. It's the Middle Ages coming back. That means people will have to go to the river to wash themselves, go to the river to get water, walk on foot for 3 days to visit a sick cousin. Secretly try to gather wood and light a fire, but be careful, not even the fire can be lit. Because at that time, you see, in the Dark Ages, right? It was always possible to light a fire and warm up a sick person and everything. Today, you can't even do that. Because let me tell you something. It's awful to fall into misery with today's mindset, because you go to certain countries in Africa or Asia or elsewhere, poor countries which didn't choose poverty, unlike Europe, which is now choosing it. These countries still have some open-mindedness. You see, you can go fishing in the sea, you arrive at 3 a.m., you catch 2 or 3 fish. With a bit of luck, you can trade them for something by the side of the road. Maybe you can trade them for some fruit. Or maybe with a bit of money, you go to the bakery to get some bread, or you give them to a tobacconist. He gives you something, you see. At least there's that kind of tolerance. In Europe, if you want to go fishing in the middle of hardship with your whole family, I guarantee you, you'll have 2 cops come down on you, fine you, and confiscate your equipment. You see, that's how it is. The problem is, there's nothing worse than sinking into misery with people like that, with idiots like that. So yeah, things are really intense right now. A lot of very intense things are happening. I'm only telling you about one of them. This one today, this regulation. I'll be back tomorrow, the day after tomorrow. I'll tell you about other things that are quite appalling. By the way, Dick Cheney is dead. Dick Cheney is dead. According to some major American universities that studied his career, he is said to be responsible for 4 to 5 million deaths. You see what I mean? Died a natural death in his book. There you go. Thank you, my friends. See you in the next video. Read astrology if you haven't yet. See you tomorrow, probably. See you soon.